So as a student, I've been exposed to a lot of different learning techniques from a lot of different people, but the one common thing that I see is that everybody's trying to make their studying easier. But this is a mistake. I've gotten straight A pluses for the last 3.5 years of my studies in engineering, while still having time to train hard in the gym, and while still having time to hang out with my friends. And the one thing that I've learned is that the studying itself is supposed to be difficult work. So in this video, we're going to discuss this idea and talk about how you can use it to save your time. So the first point I want to make is that learning isn't supposed to be easy. Learning itself requires mental effort. Now, this is where the problem comes in, because people are always trying to look for ways to make their studying easier, right? But if by making it easier, you remove the mental effort, then you also remove any learning that came with that. So because learning actually requires that mental effort, if your studying doesn't have any of that mental effort, that means your studying isn't accomplishing any learning because the link isn't there. You don't have that mental effort. So generally, low effort leads to low learning, and high effort leads to high learning. And now here's the thing, this obviously doesn't just apply to learning, this applies everywhere. If you input a low effort, you get a low reward. And if you input a high effort, you get a high reward. Like think about in the gym, right? You go to the gym, if you don't train very hard, well, you don't get very good results. But if you go to the gym and you train very hard, you train close to failure, you input a high effort, well, then you get a high reward as well. And then when you bring this back to studying, you can compare something like reviewing notes versus actually doing practice problems. So reviewing notes is a very low effort activity. Usually you can do it with little focus, with other people distracting you. It's still pretty easy to do, to look at your notes, to maybe highlight them, to rewrite them, to read them. That's something you can do with fairly low effort. But if you compare that to doing a practice exam, well, that's something that you need to focus on, that you can't really be distracted by when you're doing it. It takes a high amount of effort to do. And as a result, that's what produces the high amount of learning compared to the reviewing of notes, which only produces a low amount of learning. And so that actually brings me to another point, which is the issue with AI nowadays. A lot of people will use AI to maybe produce solutions for an assignment that they're doing. But the issue with that there is that when you do that, the effort is relatively low, right? You are not actually solving the problem. You're just getting the AI to do it for you. And so it's a low effort, which means that the learning is also low. And you might say, okay, that's okay. I'm just doing this to save time for myself. But here's the thing. You don't actually save time for yourself. You're just going to have to pay for that time when you actually need to properly learn that material later for the test or for the exam or for whatever else is coming up. And we'll talk about that more later. The big point I want to make here is if you find yourself saying that was easy after doing something like getting, AI to solve the problem for you, well, that means that because it was easy, because the effort was relatively low, the learning was also low. So that's the first insight I want you to take from this, is that learning takes a high amount of mental effort. And if you're not inputting that mental effort, then you're just not learning. Okay, and so here's how we can use that idea to save you time when you're learning, right? Because we understand that the low effort activities produce low amounts of learning and the high effort activities produce high amounts of learning. Well, no matter what, whatever goal it is you have in school, it requires some amount of learning. So let's call that, this is our goal, right? And we need some total amount of learning. Now, if you choose to do low effort activities, that produces a low amount of learning, which means you're going to need to put more time into that learning to get to the goal, right? And in contrast, if you are doing high effort activities, which produce high amounts of learning, you need to put less time into that work in order to achieve that same goal, right? So if you want to be saving time when you're studying, you want to choose the high effort path because that is going to get you towards the goal faster. More generally, we can just say that, hey, the amount of effort times the amount of time you input will get you your result. So a low amount of effort and a high amount of time will get you your result, or a high amount of effort and a low amount of time will get you your result, or even a medium amount of time and a medium amount of effort will get you your result. And so you've probably experienced both the high effort, low time, and the low effort, high time scenarios when you're trying to study. You've probably had times where you've been able to sit down, lock in, and get a ton of work done in a short period of time. And that's because your effort is high, so the amount of time you need to work is low. But you've probably also experienced the other scenario. Maybe you're trying to do work in the library and you're trying to get this assignment done. And because there's people around you, because you're distracted, the amount of actual effort going to the work is fairly minimal because it takes effort to just try to focus when there's people bothering you. It takes effort to not talk to your friends. It takes effort to do all these things. And the actual effort, the amount of focus going into the work is low, which means that the amount of time you need to spend on the work is high. And this, of course, makes sense because typically in those scenarios, you'll be sitting for long periods of time in the library with your friends and you don't end up getting that much work done. And that's because the effort is low, so the amount of time you need to spend is high to get the result, which is to finish the assignment in this case. Now, here's one more thing I want to point out. I want to point out that if we consider that initial example where we were using AI to produce solutions for an assignment, the effort required was quite low for that, right? You're just inputting your question and the AI produces a solution for you. So it doesn't take too much effort. Now, also, the time input is also fairly low, right? Because it doesn't take much time to do that process, right? And yet somehow you still complete the assignment. You still get your result. So what's really going on here then? Because if this is true, then the low effort, low time AI solution should produce a low result, but it doesn't. You still get that same result. And the thing is that this equation actually isn't quite right. The right side of the equation should actually be learning. And so you can see that, yes, in the scenario where you use AI to produce the solution for you, your effort is low, your time input is low, and you get the same result, but your learning is also low. You don't learn, you don't gain any knowledge from that, right? And so the equation is not actually supposed to be effort times time equals result. It's actually supposed to be effort times time equals learning. And now this makes sense because in the situation with the AI, because you didn't get much learning done, you will need to account for that and you will need to put more time later on when exam time comes, right? Because you didn't learn the material well the first time. So this little bit of time input that you did put in is effectively wasted. And now you just need to relearn the material anyways with more time. So really when we were using AI, we didn't save any time here. The real way to save time is to just increase the effort of the work, which decreases the amount of time to get the same result. So how do we recognize these low effort and high effort activities then? Because obviously, if we're trying to save time, we don't want to be spending time on the low effort activities. Well, whenever you're doing something, you can ask yourself this question. Is the work tedious? Is the work boring? And do you find yourself drifting away from the work? If the answer is yes, then chances are this is low effort work. And before you say that all your work is tedious and all your work is boring and your mind always drifts when you're doing all of your work, just compare relatively to other things, right? Some work, for example, maybe you're reading 100 lecture slides. That is something that is tedious, that is something that is boring, and probably your mind will drift before you finish those 100 lecture slides. But if you compare that to something like practice problems, well, that is obviously more difficult and it takes more effort, but it is definitely not as tedious. It is definitely not as boring, and your mind definitely doesn't drift as much because you're actively doing that work. So don't just sit here and say, oh, all of my work is tedious, boring, because in reality, some work definitely will be more so than others. Now, the one thing I don't want you to use as an indicator for if the work is high effort or low effort is like the relative effort in the moment, right? Because if you do a practice test or if you do any other high effort activity, that will be difficult and it'll feel like there's a lot of effort there. But also you can see that after doing a lower effort activity for a long period of time, it will feel like higher effort, right? If you sit down and you're reading notes for 6 hours, well, in that 6th hour, that's going to be incredibly difficult. That's going to feel like a very high effort activity if you've somehow made it that far, right? But does that make that high effort work? Not really, right? Because in the end, the actual effort per unit time is lower. And so I don't want you to take like how hard the work feels in the moment to be an indicator if the work is high or low effort, but you should more think, is this tedious? Is this boring? Is this something that I could do with very little focus? Is this something I can do when my mind is drifting, right? Those things are probably low effort work. And if you can just remove those, you're going to save yourself a lot more time. So yes, when you're about to work, just ask yourself these questions and you can learn to recognize if that work is going to be low effort or high effort. And if it's low effort, you cut it out. If it's high effort, you keep it, because that's going to let you get to that end result in less time. So yeah, overall, studying itself really isn't supposed to be easy. And if it is easy, then you're just not learning. So you might as well pick a high effort activity or just go and do something else, because you might as well not work if it's not actually producing anything. When you're studying, you just want to be making sure you're maximizing or increasing your mental effort so you can get more work done in less time, right? Because this will allow you more time to spend however you want. So yeah, I hope this video can help you improve your student life.